The intellectual revolt. During recent years, it has become more and more obvious that old-style, laissez-faire capitalism is finished. Far back in the 19th century, this fact had been grasped by various clear-sighted individuals, and it was later made apparent to millions by the disaster of the 1914-18 war, by the success of the Russian Revolution, and by the rise of the fascist regimes, which were not strictly capitalist and could solve problems before which the old democracies, such as Britain or the United States, remained helpless. The events of the last 6 years have merely underlined the lesson. Unmistakably, the drift everywhere is towards planned economies and away from an individualistic society in which property rights are absolute and money-making is the chief incentive. However, simultaneously with this development, there has happened an intellectual revolt, which is not simply the uneasiness of property owners who see their privileges menaced. If not a majority, at any rate, a large proportion of the best minds of our time are dismayed by the turn of events and doubtful whether mere economic security is a worthwhile objective. There is a widespread disappointment with the Russian form of socialism, and, lying deeper than this, a mistrust of the whole machine of civilization and its implied aims. Naturally, this intellectual revolt takes almost as many forms as there are individual thinkers, but there are certain main tendencies, which can be grouped as follows. 1. The pessimists. Those who deny that a planned society can lead either to happiness or to true progress. 2. The left-wing socialists. Those who accept the principle of planning, but are chiefly concerned to combine it with individual liberty. 3. The Christian reformers. Those who wish to combine revolutionary social change with adherence to Christian doctrine. 4. The pacifists. Those who wish to get away from the centralized state and from the whole principle of government by coercion. Of course, there is an overlap between these different schools of thought, and some of them also overlap with ordinary conservatism on the one side or with orthodox socialism on the other. Still, a large number of distinguished and representative thinkers can be accurately grouped under these headings. In the first of these 4 essays, I deal with those I have labeled pessimists. Perhaps the best expression of the pessimistic viewpoint, at any rate in English and in recent years, is F. A. Voigt's Unto Caesar, which was published about 1938. This heavily documented book is, in the main, an examination of communism and Nazism, written round the thesis that societies which set out to establish the earthly paradise always end in tyranny. Voigt assumes throughout his book that Russian communism and German fascism are, for practical purposes, the same thing and have almost the same objective. This is certainly an oversimplification and is unable to explain all the known facts. Nevertheless, Voigt makes out a very strong case for narrowing down the scope of politics and not expecting too much from political action. His basic argument is quite simple. A statesman who aims at perfection and thinks that he knows how to reach it will stop at nothing to drive others along the same road, and his political ideals will be inextricably mixed up with his desire to remain in power. Perfection, in practice, is never attained, and the terrorism used in pursuit of it simply breeds the need for fresh terrorism. Consequently, the attempt to establish liberty and equality always ends in the police state, whereas more limited aims, based on the realization that man's nature is full of evil, may lead to a fairly decent society. Approximately the same line is taken by the American writer Peter Drucker, author of The End of Economic Man and The Future of Industrial Man. Drucker was one of the very small handful of publicists who foretold the Russo-German Pact of 1939. Particularly in the second of the above-named books, he argues the need for what he calls a conservative revolution, meaning not a return of capitalism, but the revival of the idea of a mixed society, in which there is a system of checks and balances which make it impossible for any one section of the community to become all-powerful. This, Drucker argues, was the real aim of the 18th century leaders of the American Revolution. Other writers who have advanced rather similar arguments against perfectionism are Michael Roberts, in his book on T.E. Hulme, Malcolm Muggeridge, The 30s, and Hugh Kingsmill in The Poisoned Crown. The last-named book consists of 4 studies of Queen Elizabeth, Cromwell, Napoleon, and Abraham Lincoln. It is perhaps a somewhat perverse book, but it contains some penetrating remarks on dictatorship. The whole problem of utopian aims, and their tendency to end in tyranny, is discussed by Bertrand Russell in a number of books, particularly The Scientific Outlook, Freedom and Organization, and Power, a New Analysis. Russell has held very different political views at different periods in his life, but his vision of the future has been almost uniformly pessimistic, and he is inclined to think that liberty and efficiency are of their nature incompatible. The planned, centralized state has also been attacked on the ground that, even in terms of its own objectives, it does not work. Perhaps the ablest exposition of this viewpoint is Professor Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, which was published in 1944 and raised a great deal of discussion, especially in the United States. Hayek argues that centralism and detailed planning not only destroy liberty, but are incapable of affording as high a standard of living as laissez-faire capitalism. He claims that before Hitler came to power, his essential work had been done for him by the German Social Democrats and Communists, who had succeeded in breaking down the average German's desire for liberty and independence. His main argument is that a centralized economy necessarily gives great power to the bureaucrats at the center, and that people who want power for its own sake will gravitate towards the key positions. A rather similar line is taken in Contempt of Freedom by Professor Michael Polanyi of Manchester University, who studied conditions in the USSR over a number of years and subjected the Webb's famous book, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, to some searching criticism. The biologist James Baker has also argued, Science and the Planned State, that scientific research cannot flourish under the rule of a bureaucracy. Finally, one can number among the pessimists James Burnham, whose book, The Managerial Revolution, made such a stir when it was published 5 years ago. More particularly in his next published book, The Machiavellians, Burnham argues that neither socialism nor full democracy are attainable aims, and that the most we can do is to establish safeguards, for example, autonomous trade unions and a free press, against the abuse of power. He goes much further than the other writers I have named, in that he denies even the possibility of decent political behavior and merely advocates that we should use political trickery for limited ends instead of extravagant ones. But at many points, his worldview coincides with that of many others. The term pessimist fits all of these writers insomuch that they refuse to believe in the possibility of an earthly utopia, while most of them also do not believe in a next world in which this one will be put right. Except, perhaps, for Drucker and Burnham, who wish to guide the existing trend rather than oppose it. The weakness of all of them is that they are not advocating any policy likely to get a large following. Hayek's able defense of capitalism, for instance, is wasted labor, since hardly anyone wishes for the return of old-style capitalism. Faced with the choice between serfdom and economic insecurity, the masses everywhere would probably choose outright serfdom, at least if it were called by some other name. Most of the others are putting forward what is, in essence, a religious view of life without the consolations of orthodox religion. If one were obliged to give the writers of this school a political label, one would have to call them conservatives. But in most cases, theirs is a romantic conservatism, which fights against irreversible facts. But that is not to deny that they and other writers of kindred tendency have uttered much useful criticism of the folly and wickedness of the totalitarian age.